Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. With me today is Geoff Horsman. Geoff is a very interesting guy, and I've known him for a few years. And we have disagreements about some things, which I'm interested in looking at. But welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Francis. It's nice to be here.
Geoff is a professor of biochemistry. Is that correct?
Yep.
At Wilfrid Laurier University, which for people who are unaware of Wilfrid Laurier, it was ground zero in the craziness a couple of years ago with Lindsay Shepherd case. And I have a lot of connections with Laurier because there is the local chapter of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, which also has David McNally and um, William McNally and David Haskell, who I know very well as well. And so that's very interesting, that kind of stuff. Um, and your work is that you are looking at microbes and how they form complex molecules. That's your research area, which we might want to talk about a little bit if you're interested in that. But our more shared kind of area of interest is diversity, inclusion, and equity, its influence on science, the sciences. We will just refer to this as DIE. Critics of diversity, inclusion, and equity refer to it as DIE, although this could result in a harassment charge against Geoff, because that has happened, where
Hmm.
people have been accused of harassment for doing that. And also, there is wokeism. So, our views on wokeism. So, are wokeism and DIE the same thing? Are they different? And what that kind of stuff? Then there is Geoff's work with the school board, or his criticism of the school board, and I'll put a link to his two articles that are very interesting about what's going on with the Waterloo school board. Uh, and then finally, we'll end on a very non-controversial area, which is all the meltdown about discussing Israel Palestine in the current October 7th context and what that's doing to the whole university system. So we have quite a loaded thing for the first segment, and then we'll do that for about an hour, and then we'll turn the screens. Geoff will take over. Geoff will ask me questions because I think it's a very good format because it allows for things to be covered which might not be, and as well sort of allows a different framing of various issues in case the framing has been somewhat biased on my part, unintentionally biased on my part. So but before we get into all of that, Geoff, perhaps you can tell the audience a little bit about your work, your interests, what makes you tick, those sorts of things.
Sure. Well, I mean, my day-to-day work as a biochemist is really interested, as you mentioned, in how microorganisms mostly make large organic molecules. And so I have a lab. I've got a postdoc, a couple grad students, and undergrad. So the labs are actually physically small at Laurier. So generally, I keep things pretty small. And I've been at Laurier for 12 years now, so quite a long time. Um, and Really, the reason we're talking is because I guess 2.5 years ago or so, I um, applied for a grant, a federal grant, research grant. It was called the NFRF. This is the New Frontiers in Research Foundation, I believe, and they have a grant called the Exploration Grant. So it's for high risk, high reward ideas. So this was, I ended up getting the grant, and it was a really, I was very proud of the idea. Um, but but what I noticed in this grant, that I'd never encountered before, was that it had a very significant portion dedicated to EDI.
Mm.
So you had, in fact, what they would do first is look at your EDI section, and it was pass fail. So if you
Mm.
fail that, they don't even look at the science. Okay, so right away so it's like, okay, you got my attention. So they got my attention, and so then they had a rubric. And the rubric had things like you have to identify systemic barriers.
Hmm.
Now I'm a biochemist, so I thought, well, I'm not a social scientist, so how am I supposed to do this exactly? Right? I mean, it sounds naive, right? They
Yeah,
actually don't
yeah,
want you to do any science, right? That's not.
yeah,
But at the
yeah,
time, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to take this seriously. What's the best way to approach a new area if I want to learn about EDI?
yeah,
What do you do? Well, I think the standard approach would be like find the best writers who have a range of views, both criticizing it and promote, try to find the best authors. So there are many. You're
yeah.
wagging your finger at me already, right? That's not how it works. You don't try to get the clash of the dialectic. That's not
No,
what you're supposed to do
no,
in a
no, no.
critical theory world. But so what I did is I looked. There's a lot of resources with links. There are actually scientists who build themselves as experts in EI, and they have reading lists.
Yeah.
So I read books like Kendi, How
Mm.
to Be an Anti-Racist, right? And that book is just very disturbing.
Yes, it
It's
is.
promoting racial discrimination,
I
promoting
know.
outright racism,
Yeah.
right? And it was almost stomach churning. Um, and then of course on the other side, I was just going for walks and listening to the Glenn show, Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter.
Yeah.
That was actually quite informative, just getting up to speed on what they were
Yeah.
thinking about
Yeah. Yeah.
this. And of course I read uh quite early on I read James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose Cynical Theories,
Yeah.
which I found was a pretty good introduction to,
Yes,
wow,
that's
this is
excellent.
the theoretical origin of all these ideas. And then I end up reading a lot. It really, I kind of put myself through an education in a short time. And I guess, well, since then because I've now every email you get from the university, you recognize this critical theory and what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
There's no allowances for seeking disconfirmation as you would do in a liberal science construction, as
Yep.
Jonathan
Yep.
Rauch might put it. So anyway, I mean, yeah, and I got connected with Will and David as you mentioned, and uh, gotten more involved in SAFs because of that. I actually
Mm.
never heard of SAFs 2.5
Yeah.
years ago. I
No,
never heard of it. Yeah.
people who are watching this who are not a member of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, this is the best organization we have in Canada to fight against this. It's not. It's got. It's a difficult organization to deal with because it has limited resources and so on, and there are a lot of problems that we're facing on many levels, but it is at least a networking opportunity to meet people who are hopefully principled defenders of open inquiry, academic standards, these sorts of things. That part of our mission statement. Our mission is to
Mm-hmm.
do this. So, and we're trying to hold the line, which is not easy. So, how many people are members now of the? So you have a local chapter of
Yeah.
the Waterloo, and is sorry, Laurier Waterloo? Is that one? Is that one
Yeah.
local
Yeah.
chapter?
And it's not really that big. There's just a few of us, at Laurier, um, and similarly at Waterloo.
Yeah.
I think Waterloo, you might be surprised to learn that I think it's far worse at Waterloo.
No, I'm not. I'm
Yeah.
not. Nothing surprises me about this
Yeah.
anymore. I don't.
So
This needs to be kind of documented as to what is going on. I
yeah,
think Laurier got beaten back a bit by what happened with the Lindsay Shepherd stuff. Although
maybe that's what happened because
I think
the people
so.
I know at Laurie, they seem actually terrified.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it sounds actually like a really scary sort of place for anyone who's got
So,
any sort of free thoughts.
so in terms of Laurier, Wilfrid Laurier University, you've been there since 2011, is that correct?
Yep.
So were you aware of the Lindsay Shepherd stuff that was unfolding?
I I knew of it
Yeah,
because it was a buzz, but
yeah,
I was on sabbatical that year, and the thing is about traditional being in the sciences world, and she was in communications or something, and there's
yeah,
kind of this, you know it doesn't speak well of ourselves as scientists. We kind of look down our nose sometimes at the arts people. We kind
yeah,
of think, oh,
well,
it just, and make fun of them as, oh, I don't know what they're on about again. They're fighting about something ridiculous.
yeah.
And I
No, it's
honestly
kind of
didn't
sad.
really pay any attention to it. Like, I didn't notice it, but I have to say, I kind of absorbed what was in the air.
Mm,
And I kind of assumed that Lindsay Shepherd was kind of being naughty somehow.
yeah.
And that was just kind of, and everyone kind of just would mention things like that would confirm that general sense that
Mm,
she did something wrong or untoward.
yeah.
And that was pretty much as much as I knew.
Were you aware of Jordan Peterson at that time?
uh Again, only very vaguely. Like, I had heard the name, and again, I kind of just heard, in the media, and I kind of got the sense that he was kind of an alt-right, you know yeah, I know it sounds ridiculous,
No,
but
it's true
that's
though.
what
Like this
actually,
is what
but that's what
happens.
people actually think, right,
Like
if you
this is
don't
what this
actually
is what
go to the
yeah.
source. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And this is a common tactic right now is that we
Hmm.
have all these kinds of accusations being made about, people which are totally
Yeah.
untrue,
Hmm.
but it's sort of, where there's smoke, there's fire, and you can't
Yeah.
help it because and one of the big problems is, a university, universities used to be, you know, have some credibility about what they were doing, and people would say, well, how if for a university to do these things, there must have been something that led them to do it. It couldn't just be them acting in this autocratic fashion, trying
Yeah.
to impose some absurd thing. This
Yeah.
this is the kind of problem. Um, yeah, so that's very interesting. So in terms of diversity, inclusion, equity, this is sort of one of your battles now. Is trying to fight against this imposition on the sciences. What have you seen with respect to that?
Well,
Oh,
what
so
I've seen.
before we get in, maybe what is your how do you define this diversity, inclusion, and equity? What is it that you see this as being about?
Okay. Yeah. So, equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think, they're nice sounding words. And I guess, like many things in our current era, there are different definitions. And so there's kind of a sneaky so when equity, most people might think that just means fairness. For
Mm,
example, when I was going through the tenure process, I went to workshops, and they have an equity rep there. And their job was to make sure that the rules were applied equally to everyone, right? So that when they would sit in from applicant to applicant going up for tenure, if something went a little off the rails, say, oh, no, no, that's not, you got to apply the rules the same way, right?
mm-hmm.
But now we know it's got another meaning, and that's
Opposite.
a quality of outcome. So
Yes.
I think equity is really just looking at that final, um, it's a quality of outcome, right? It's deciding that you want to have a certain representation
Okay. So
of
the
different groups.
outcome then is representation.
That's how I would see the equity
Okay.
side
Not
of it.
we all have the same economic kind of, because I was listening, and we'll get into James Lindsay a little bit here too, because you appreciate the work of James Lindsay.
Yeah.
I do too. So I really appreciate, although I'm a critic of James Lindsay, I think he has a lot of important things to say, and he has a very good. I'm not sure if you listen to the New Discourses podcast.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Anyway, he's got three great ones on well, ironically, from my standpoint, Marxism and DEI. So he's seeing it as a Marxist thing, the
Right.
diversity. But he goes through for about 3 hours on each of these diversity, inclusion, and equity, which, although I'm critical of his seeing it as a Marxist thing, I'm appreciative of his ability to sort of synthesize this kind of, because it's difficult if you're to go into all this literature, and he's quite good at that.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said, and I think it's George Frederickson is the in the pub. It comes out of the public administration stuff, diversity, inclusion, and equity. I believe in the 50s, so or maybe the 60s, but it's quite old. It's not a new thing. Anyway, this person is Frederickson. I'm not sure if it's he who said this, but the definition of equity was equal shares.
Right. I've heard him say that too.
So equal shares, but that raises an interesting question. What are you getting a share of? What is your equal share that you're going to be getting?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you and I probably agree that this is kind of a representational, like equal
Mm-hmm.
shares of representation, which results in all these targeting kinds of things. Because the argument is that the shares should be, well, that's an interesting question. What does that mean? So,
Right.
like, should Black people, in fact, have more shares than white people in, for example, STEM, which is representation? So, the number of people in biochemistry. Like, I'm not sure how many Indigenous professors are there in biochemistry
I don't know.
in Wilfrid Laurier.
I don't know. I mean, none that are like self-identifying.
None that you've
That's,
made aware of.
no. If they
Yeah,
are, they don't go and,
say it. They could be. It's
yeah, they
all
could be. Yeah.
self-identification anyway. Um, or you could be Indigenous.
Yeah.
Like we don't know. Like
Right.
unless you're going to declare it, then we don't know. So the idea would be, I assume, this is what I've heard, that depending upon the percentage of Indigenous people in some kind of some sort of context. So it might be Ontario, it might be the city of Waterloo or wherever, like Brantford or etc. It might be Canada, etc. Like whatever the percentage of Indigenous people is, that should be the number percentage wise of Indigenous people in biochemistry.
Yeah, but they never really define it precisely.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the vague idea that's put forth. It should be representative of the population, and they never define exactly what population or what the number is. Yeah. So that would
Yeah.
be, I think that's kind of the equity, right?
Yeah, so that's the equity, and Lindsay and his three things, which I highly recommend. Although I think there's flaws, they're flaws, but hey, we get this is what people don't understand is that you don't have to agree with 100% of things that people say to get things out of it, and we have to sort of learn that because we become so tribal in our approach that you hear one thing that someone says and it's like they call you they call you a monster. I'm not kidding. Like if you have a political position that's you're not even insisting that your view must prevail. You're just saying, hey, I have a different view than you. Then you're a monster because like that's an unacceptable opinion. Um anyway, so that's and according to Lindsay, this is driving. It's this kind of, and that might be, do you think that is what people mean by quote unquote social justice, or does social justice have a different meaning?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, because I was just thinking about
And
this today, actually.
I kind of see them as, as a variety of different terms too. I think, yeah, I think social justice is, uh, well, I guess because I'm still influenced by the Pluckrose Lindsay critical social justice.
Yeah,
I do see it as kind of this way of broader approaches to social engineering. We can apply expertise. We have a worldview that's based on oppression,
yeah,
and we can apply various interventions and treatments to try to approach more of a vision of a perfect future with everyone's treated equally, and it's going to be a utopian ideal. I think that's kind of the idea of social justice, that you can actually, and I think it often is the reason I think the government's pushing is because it often involves government intervention, the government to take over, and from a top down, we're going to engineer a perfect world, and we're going to make a new department to take over housing or any other sort of thing to engineer a perfect outcome. And so I think that might be one reason why it's being pushed, because it does benefit government because it can expand government.
Mm. So social justice is probably broader than equity. Equity is one of the kind of aspects of, so a more socially just world would be a more equitable or a perfectly equitable world, whatever that would
Yeah, like I think of EDI, I kind of see the E and the I as pillars holding up the ideal of diversity.
be.
You know, so diversity is the idea that, I mean, you often say diversity is our strength. Diverse teams perform better. No one really provides evidence of it. I think there's good evidence. I read that David Epstein book, Range, which is really fascinating about. And he starts out with a Roger Federer versus who's the other tennis player, or Tiger Woods. It was a golfer, but it's just the
Okay.
idea that you have lots of different expertises
Yeah.
and experiences that gives you a certain range. And so he was making the point of broad knowledge
Mm.
and different ideas, and that's kind of the what the Mott, I guess, in a Mott and Bailey conception
Yeah.
of the diversity as having lots of different perspectives. They often retreat to that, but really what it means is different ethnicities, sexualities, these sorts of things. People who look different, but really all adhere to the same ideology. So I kind of see the diversity as people who um, look different but think the same. And equity is one of the pillars. It's an approach to get there, to technically
Okay.
apply equity by saying we have certain percentage standards to achieve diversity goals, and then inclusion. Of course, I would see the other pillar, and that's really just a censorship mechanism to
Yeah.
make sure that it can't be questioned, and that's the other thing that holds up this diversity ideal.
Yeah. So that's your conception is a little bit different than Lindsay's then, which is equity is the driver of it. So that's kind of the vision. And
Mm-hmm.
then diversity, according to him, which like this is as I'm trying to figure this out. I find the whole thing, it has to be kind of pulled apart and try to figure out all the different things that are going on. According to him, um, that equity is the driver, and this is out of these three. I highly recommend them. These three things on new discourses. There's about 3 hours each, but they're very interesting. And he just kind of summarizes a lot of the stuff and gives his own commentary about it. Um, Equity is the driver, and then diversity and inclusion are the two sides of the kind of process oriented thing to get to equity.
Okay,
So,
so I've flipped diversity and equity.
but it might be, I'm slightly sympathetic to your position because I do think diversity is what we heard about first. So when I first started in 2008 at Mount Royal, we got these like lanyards which had diversity on them, and we had this diversity office. I really didn't know what people were talking about, and for a number of years, about 4 years. Every time I would go to one of these, I would ask them what are they talking about with respect to diversity, and they were very cagey about it. And it turned out basically it was a targeting that they wanted. Like that's what they meant by diversity. Is this, you know, represent, shares of representation that they were working towards, but they never specified that. And often, and you mentioned the Mott and Bailey uh, type of strategy. I'm not sure if viewers know this, but it's a military type of analogy where you have your motte, which is your safe place, which is your usually a castle on a hill, which is not nice to be in because it's damp and it's not whatever. And then you've got this wonderful valley that you want to hold, which has farmland and everything. And you're trying to get that, but whenever you're kind of challenged, you revert to your damp castle. Anyway, this is the the strategy of this linguistic subterfuge, I guess. It's a manipulative tactic, and it's called by a number of other things too. I've heard it as the radical truistic shuffle is another one, which you have the radical definition and then you have the truistic definition. So the truistic one is that it's just banal, everyone accepts it. And then the radical one is like, it's interesting, but it's highly contentious and controversial. So the Bailey is the radical, and the Mott is the truistic, and that these are interchanged all the time. So you think you're talking about the Bailey or the radical thing, and then you get told that no, it's this truistic thing. It's like, well, why would we be spending all this time talking about this banal thing that everyone agrees with? And that's just because the way of doing it. But the Bailey or the radical thing is the targeting, because most people don't agree with that. Like, if you really pulled it apart. Whereas the Mott and the truism thing is the diversity of ideas.
Right.
And this is how it started off, according to Lindsay. I think it was you get people with different lenses. It's like the people feeling the elephant. Like, have you heard about that? Blind people you have to have a whole bunch. If you blind a bunch of blind people with the elephant, you have to put them all over feeling the elephant, because if you just have a blind person holding the trunk, they're going to think this is a weird. So you got to have them all there, and then they can combine their insights. So that's the Mott, that kind of idea. And Lindsay talks about this in the public administration. It's like, how do you have better service provision and better, bureaucratic things? Well, you want to have in your brainstorming sessions people with a lot of different perspectives, and then you can actually have better decision making because of that. That was the beginning.
and I referred to that book Range, and I'm just going to mention one thing about it, because I often tell people about this. We're talking about diversity of ideas.
Yeah.
There's these problem solving. If some company's got a problem.
Yeah.
And it started out with some pharmaceutical company where they had a problem with a synthesis, and the chemists were stuck on it. This was Eli Lilly, I think, like a top company. They've got hundreds of top chemists.
Yeah.
And after a while, someone convinced an executive to throw it out there publicly and ask for solutions. And a lawyer solved it because he just happened to see he was working on some patent that had this solution.
Yeah.
So, and similar things have happened all the time. So diversity of ideas. Yeah, it's the Mott.
Yeah. So what is this? What does this do to this? Okay, so we got equity, which is got a Mott Bailey. So it's got a Mott Bailey for all of these terms. You got what you think it is, which everyone agrees with, and then you've got this thing which is going to be at least fought over. And then you switch them up when you're talking about them. So we talked about diversity is like that. Equity is what's the kind of Mott and Bailey with respect to equity?
It's fairness. So equal application, that everyone gets the same, but actually that's not what it means. It means in practice, you start to actually change the rules in order to achieve different outcomes. I think that's really what it is.
Yeah.
And
so
inclusion's pretty straightforward.
An example of this. Well, the big one we see in so fairness. So the idea of fairness, definitions of fairness. So, and I think Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about this a little bit in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which is like different conceptions of justice as part of it too. So, and in the equity literature, there's something, it has a kernel of truth to it, which is if you have a blind person who's trying to access education, then no one can disagree with providing, books in Braille to that person, because that's how they're going to be able to. That is giving them some kind of treatment that will
Right.
enable them to
Right.
access. So that's kind of
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
maybe the inclusion. So we've got diversity, inclusion, and equity. I'm getting a bit there, like they're all kind of got these things. So that's part of it. Like that's part of the whole nature of this is that
Hmm.
people got sucked into the removing barriers idea,
Hmm.
but then it got turned into the what you needed to do the job properly was being the focus. So that now you were going to remove those kind of demands which would enable you to do the job properly.
Hmm.
And I'm just trying to think about whether that's inclusion or equity.
Inclusion, I see that as the one that's really about silencing dissent.
Yeah. Discomfort.
I think that because to me it's at least how I view it, how I've seen it in practice is that people need to feel included,
Mm,
and it's kind of like the belonging, right? It's like, so if someone says something that makes someone feel marginalized or not included, then that person that speech shouldn't be allowed, right? Those ideas need to be
yeah.
kept out of it, so it's a safe, inclusive space. But we don't really talk about, well, now you've excluded someone in
Mm.
order to achieve inclusion. So it's just it it's not workable.
Yeah. And it used to the mot for that is discriminatory things. So like people used to be discriminated against, many, certainly
Right. Yep.
certainly, 30, 40, 50 years ago, we're
Yeah.
kind of referring to that. So the fact that women were seen as not having the mental capacity or they're going to go have kids anyway. So why do we want to have like this was all kind of used to prevent women from being
Hmm.
able to access various opportunities. And then so the idea of inclusion is that you wanted to ensure that they were able to do that. And perhaps you might even go so far to see, various behaviors which might be considered to be harassing. This was making women feel that they didn't belong.
Yeah. But the problem with inclusion, of course, um is that we have to think about how we got over these things,
Mm,
right? So I think I remember I think it's Andrew Sullivan was talking about the gay marriage issue,
yep.
right? So he was saying that it it wasn't by censoring that you got over gay marriage. It was because you allowed the debate to occur openly, right?
Mm,
You allowed the public to hear both sides of the issue, and over time the public moved based on being persuaded.
yeah.
So I would argue that inclusion actually works against whoever it is you want to protect, right? I think that the only reason we've made this progress, the reason that women feel more comfortable in the academy, have more opportunities now, is because we allowed the debate to occur. We didn't start telling men
Mm,
you can't say anything,
yeah.
right? And so we got to a point that was pretty good.
Yeah.
And now we're starting to say, well, now the standard isn't anywhere else. The standard isn't historically. The standard now is a utopian ideal, I think.
And the utopian ideal is what?
Well, it seems to me no one feels any discomfort or harm. Um, that's in the extreme case.
Mm,
You know, they say things like people um, are not included if they feel harm or sense discomfort from even seeing like a, we've had names changed of schools because they've said that students will be harmed by the name on the school. right now. So that's, I don't know how you, like, the utopian is ideal. I think it's just you never feel any emotional discomfort, which is obviously impossible. But
But is that really like? I think this is a little bit not understanding the equity driving. So maybe Lindsay's right, because if you're a Jewish student who feels uncomfortable about all these people chanting, you know, from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, which there are a lot of Jewish students who feel uncomfortable about that.
mhm, yeah,
Do they care? Does the university administration care?
no,
So
not
it's
really.
like it's not about, and this is why safetyism is not, I don't think, is a proper analysis
Right.
either, because it's not safety for all, it's safety for what you want to achieve in terms of these equitable shares.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
you're trying to achieve these equitable, that's the utopia, I think. Is
Yeah.
utopia when we've got the equitable shares.
Right.
Because then, or maybe not, maybe it's, we got to have at Evergreen State College, which is my favorite my favorite utopia. It was, black people get the food, white people don't get to eat this food because black people have been oppressed for their entire existence. Now it's their turn to, you know determine how things are. Like that
For a
was their,
little while. Yeah.
well, maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure what the, like, what is the out, is it when we get proportional representation of all these groups, have we reached utopia at that time? And it seems to be, and this is another aspect which I've been doing some work on, is what's called the professional managerial class. I'm
Mm,
not sure if you've
yeah.
heard of this analysis.
Maybe not.
Alan Sokol is. Do you know who Alan Sokol is?
Oh yeah, the Sokol hoax. Yeah.
Alan Sokol is an amazing thinker because of his clarity. Like, this is what I find it so frustrating, is we need to get more clarity, less muddiness,
Yeah.
and we really need to push ahead people who think clearly about. Now they might be not correct on all the things, James Lindsay, for example, but they're trying to make things more clear, so we can at least talk about this and figure it out. Whereas, like, a bunch of people just want to muddy things so that they can get their perspective, the one that's going to be doing this. Anyway, he's talking about he has a great review of a book called Cancelled, which I was just reading yesterday. I've read it before, but I'm reading it a lot because Sokol has a very a lot of good insights. Anyway, the professional managerial class is the group. So in the current phase of capitalist development, there's been a huge growth in the West of this professional managerial class that is the one that manages the system. So they don't own what's called the means of production. They're not Bill Gates, they're not, Jeff Bezos, etc. They're all these managers in human resources departments and professionals and law societies and all this stuff. And they are involved in managing the working class. And it's a large layer that's doing this. Anyway, this class is really the diversity, inclusion, and equity stuff is what they're involved with, as well as wokeism, which we'll talk about shortly. Um, and they are saying in the professional managerial class, there should be proportional representation of they're not saying for the people who do the garbage, all of the garbage cleanup, that should have proportional representation. Like, they're not arguing for that, but they're arguing within the professional managerial class for proportionate representation. That's their
Hmm.
that's what they
Right. Yeah.
want. And
Yeah.
once we get the professional managerial class proportionate representation, then everything will be great. Or maybe we even need higher representation of certain groups for whatever reason, but they're fit. This is what most of their discussions are about.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Like, I think Lindsay, this is Lindsay's for you, and I think I'm starting to be convinced because I thought too diversity is our strength, and I heard all this stuff about diversity all the time, but diversity I think is kind of a mechanism type of thing as opposed to the goal type of thing.
Yeah. Maybe.
What do you think about that?
Well, it's possible.
Is that
You
the
know, it's
utopia, or do you think that there's another? Is there some other utopia that's being sought after?
I don't know. I mean, part of me, part of me thinks that it's not really thought through. That
No.
these ideas are intentionally vague
Yeah.
and fluid and adaptable to suit whoever has power and can accrue more power to themselves
Mm.
and intimidate people. Like I don't think it's like I think we make a mistake when we think that this is like a really well developed um thought through theory of how things are going to work. I think it's more of a revolutionary movement that's just about seeding discord and chaos and accruing power to people and giving them the power to intimidate and silence critics.
Uh, so why do you think it's a revolutionary type of movement?
Well, I think because part of it is that what you're doing is you're dividing people into a variety of different groups and apportioning benefits to different groups depending on some variable but generally ethnic and based hierarchy of oppression.
Yeah.
and you see discord, and I think it's a way to control people. um do you know, is it Yeonmi Park? Do you know
Uh,
her?
is
she's
that
a she's the North Korean.
okay?
She
Yep.
escaped from North Korea,
Yep.
and she's got a book. I can't remember what it's called, but or a couple books. But she was saying that in North Korea that they divided people into 50 different classes, 50 different groups, and
I
she said
heard
it's the
China did
most.
this too. Is 12.
Yeah, and she said it's a really extremely ethnically homogeneous society, but they figured, well, we got to divide you somehow, and
Yep.
it made a way to really control people was her theory. And yeah,
So
so
a divide and conquer kind of thing.
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to figure this out. Um, is it opposed to capitalism? This
They
this
say they are. I
is
mean,
it a
most of the
non-capitalist utopia?
that's what it sure sounds like. Most people seem to think that. I mean, they often talk about. You often see capitalism as, especially see things like climate justice and the racial justice. They often talk about how they're anti-capitalist, and many of the activists are self-described socialists. Um,
Yeah, well, you are, as we know from the LGBTQ2S thing, what you say you are is not necessarily what you are. But this is like that's kind of one of the things that people, in terms of my trying to figure out the differences between Marxism and wokeism, is that there's a bunch
right,
of these woke people who are claiming that they're Marxists. So they
right.
must be Marxists. But like, is that if I just call myself a man now, am I a man? Because like this sort of thing. That's another issue. But that's interesting about the 50, because in China, because this is James Lindsay as well, it's talking about Maoism, uh, which is that's an interesting question about whether Maoism is Marxist or not. Or his I don't really like using the word Marxist myself because I think that's a kind of an ideological position, whereas the theory is historical materialism. And the question academically is historical materialism a valid perspective or not? Is it true? Well, true is a bit highfalutin, but valid. And this is where I was thinking when you were talking about the sciences because I'm in the humanities, so like that's my area. Although I'm in political science, political science should never have called itself political science. Well, there might be some falsification exercises in political science, but most of what political, actual reputable political scientists do, who are not activists, is they are engaged in a humanitarian, the project of the humanities, which includes philosophy, history, etc. And the difference between the humanities and the socials and the sciences is falsification, which is the sciences, and argumentation, convincing argumentation is the humanities. So both are valid things. Like the humanities isn't as certain because valid argumentation is something which is not quite as like this. There's more wiggle room in trying to figure out whether something's a valid argument or not. Someone like Bertrand Russell was involved in like looking at these kinds of questions. Um, but in terms of valid argumentation about these various things, this is something which we should also be working on in the universities, is determining whether arguments are valid or not necessarily falsifiable, because that's a very high bar to have a
Right. Yeah.
falsifiable. Like we wouldn't be able to talk about a lot of things if we insisted on on falsifiability.
Right.
Like, does God exist or something like that?
Right.
Like,
Right.
I don't believe you
Well,
can falsify that
yeah, I
proposal.
don't know. I mean, I think determining whether an argument is valid is difficult too. I think in the academy, the best thing to do is seek disconfirmation, I think, is hear the other argument. Who's arguing against this? And just
Yeah,
make sure you hear that
yeah, but
and
once you
hear the
hear
smart.
it, you got to go.
Right.
You now heard it. So your piece, for example, which I want to talk to you about as well, which I should get onto. I'm getting stuck here on which is very interesting, but I'm not doing my job here in terms of moving things along. Your school board piece, which you're sort of doing, you're not really doing a scientific analysis there. Like you're not doing some kind of falsifiability thing.
No.
You're saying there's this head of the board when there was an attempt to figure out whether critical race theory was being taught in the school system,
Mm-hmm.
the board chair, like it's the head of the
The
board,
director. The director.
who's that?
The director.
Yeah, who is the director?
Jiwan Chanaka is his name.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, people should look at this piece because it's excellent. Anyway, because you're doing the sort of humanities, you're engaging
Yeah.
in humanities thing here. You're saying this board director says in response to this demand that we investigate whether critical race theory is being taught in the schools, comes up with this barrage of emotional claims that for some reason the LGBTQ community is brought into this, which is not really the critical race theory thing, saying that they're all saying they're going to commit suicide because of the lack of safety, and there's all the police have been involved because of all the threats and everything, and so on and so forth. And you're saying, well, first of all, we haven't heard anything about this, so what is the evidence? Like, is there evidence for the police involvement and so on? And then you did a bunch of freedom of information requests to get that, and then you have this evidence now that you're saying, okay, well, your argument is if this were true, what this person is saying, one would expect there to be documents showing that the police were called and all the other sorts of things that are going on.
Well, I'd
That,
even take it one step.
yeah.
Well, I was going to take it one step back without even thinking about evidence. Just sort of just a simple test on how people react, because I think we've gotten very used to just hearing and almost accepting lies from our public officials.
Yeah.
And so if they come out with a fantastical claim and everyone just kind of goes, oh, okay. And if you're, especially if they're surrounded, it's like a one party school board, everyone's like, oh, that's just terrible. Oh, wow. I can't believe all these threats, physical violence, etc. Oh, it's just terrible. Poor you. Um, but I think it's what you do is just this. You ask yourself, if it were really true, how would people actually respond? Right. In my case, there is like, well, people would be very concerned about safety of the schools, and
Yeah.
nobody was, right? So, and I've started just applying this, you know, at the university, and I see, oh, if people actually believe this is what you'd respond, and then I've actually employed this and gotten very hostile responses, and I can't talk about those details, but that's kind of, I wanted to get to a corollary, sort of like working through this sort of set of what happens, and then if you actually behave as you might be expected to be true, like, oh, this idiot actually thinks I'm being serious, he's exposing me. So I
Yeah.
think that kind of, if you start to just think of like, what if people actually were all speaking truthfully, it's a very different world in many cases.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think we need these, but that's not a scientific way of looking at it.
No,
That's probably a
no.
humanities way of looking at
Mm-hmm.
it. It's a way of, or maybe even well, it's using tools. Like, see, so we need these. We all need all these tools to live in the world properly, and
Yeah.
meaningfully, and so on. Science is obviously the linchpin for it,
Mm-hmm.
because science comes up against reality in a much more, kind of clear way.
Mm-hmm.
It has the most refined methods.
Right.
And so if we've lost science, then it's over. This is terrible. But I think Terry Glavin, who I had on the show a couple of times ago, he was kind of mentioning this kind of problem with the postmodernist kind of developments, which is the assault on truth, the idea of truth.
Yeah.
That's kind of was the beginning of the end. When that started to happen in the
Yeah.
60s, I guess. So it's not even that people are lying to us. So people are lying to us all the time. That's happened. That's always happens. People in power lie because they want to maintain their power, and if they don't lie, then they could be removed from power. But that's not the real problem. The problem is people don't care that they're
Yeah.
lying, because lying and truthfulness don't matter anymore because there's no truth. So
Mm-hmm.
if I'm going to say there's no such thing as truth, then why am I going to get upset about someone lying to me? So
Yeah.
kind of those. So this has kind of created a fertile soil for all sorts of problems.
And
Um,
that's actually interesting with respect to Laurier. And I'm thinking back to the Lindsay Shepherd affair when I
mhm,
wasn't paying attention.
yep.
But it blew up in the national and international press because the professors who struggled her were exposed as lying. There were no complaints, and it was all just a complete, you know, insanity. Now, I think I heard Lindsay Shepherd on a podcast really saying, "Oh yeah, that wouldn't happen now because we've been demoralized," and I think that's true.
Yeah.
Things like that happen all the time now. They've accelerated, and we just see it openly, and they record it in these school board meetings. They're just openly just doing crazy things, and people don't even care. The local paper just kind of ignores it, and we just go on. And I think there is a demoralization that happens to people, and they start to just accept lies. I think we have to stop that. I think we actually have to start documenting the lies and
Yeah.
meticulously calling them out, and just that's kind of the reason we're starting this Substack as these parents to try to, we just got to document it, and we just have to
Yeah.
do it, and it's
Yeah.
hard work, but
And I think too, and I have some experience. which I
Yeah,
can't talk about, except for the Lethbridge, University of Lethbridge thing. So
right.
that is that's ongoing.
Oh,
We'll
so
talk.
you can talk about that one.
I can talk about that one.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Okay.
Oh yeah. No, that's like open season.
All
That
right.
which is actually better. Like it's a better case because it's so pure. It's a pure
Right.
situation.
Clear cut.
As well, something's unfolding at the University of Alberta right now involving me speaking as well. So
Mm.
that's all happening too. So Alberta is ground zero in fighting this, and I think we got a shot because it's like British Columbia right off. Ontario probably right off. Quebec maybe that Quebec might have more. They they
Hmm.
got they got history of BC is just like unbelievable. Um, anyway, in terms of sorry, I lost my train of thought here. I got distracted with that. You were just mentioning about the Lindsay Shepherd thing. So
Right.
and that the demoralization and this is we gotta kind of strategize as to how to kind of build up something out of the ashes.
Hmm.
And even if you lose, it is important to document things for future generations. I think we
Yeah.
should have a generational view of this, not just
Yeah.
I'm in my little petty, kind of battle here, and I'm one person, but we have, and I'm sure people were doing this in uh, the case of Stalinism. I'm not sure about Maoism, whether people were documenting this in Maoism, but totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany is a very good, like, that's another situation. There was a period before, and Nazi Germany is especially important because it wasn't a feudal society. So in Russia and China, things are muddied because you're dealing with a feudal society, which was not highly developed in terms of its understanding of things. So you had a lot of problems with the peasantry. But in Nazi Germany, you had the most advanced scientific country in the
Hmm.
world
Yeah.
that disintegrated. So what happened in the late 20s in the
Right.
universities in Nazi Germany?
Oh, did you see Neil Ferguson's article in the Free Press this week?
No, I have not seen
You
that.
should read it. Yeah, it's about the universities. He's
Yeah,
drawing parallels because they went to the right and you had to have these pledges, and it was like they purged the best professors because they weren't ideologically pure.
yeah,
So, yeah, fascinating read.
yeah. So this is kind of where we're at here. And this is
Mm.
why it's so frustrating to deal with people who are going, oh, well, it'll pass like all things. Like, no, this will not pass. This needs to be fought
Yep.
like tooth and nail. And every single, it's hard because it's exhausting. It's hard to know when to dig in and when to just go, oh, I got too many irons in the fire here.
Right.
I can't keep them all going and I got to do it. So, we have certain things, your school board thing, that's just an excellent case because it's just
Yeah.
so the Lethbridge case is excellent. And the current final subject matter, Israel-Palestine meltdown. So I think that's why a lot of these things are happening about the discussion of the universities now because of the Israel-Palestine kind of problems,
Yeah.
like discussing
Maybe.
Israel-Palestine.
But just before I move on to that, one thing about organization that I wanted to mention
Yep.
is so our SAFs is kind of small, and I think it's partly because SAFs, for whatever reason, has gotten painted. And I encountered this. People say it's a alt-right organization, which
Yep.
is just ridiculous. It's a very diverse like ideologically diverse group. Um, but we've got one of these heterodox academy campus communities,
Mm.
and I think it's got more of a neutral brand. So we've
Yeah.
attracted a lot more professors. We've got about 10 people who are showing up for monthly meetings,
Oh, yeah.
and we started to write letters to the administration. So I think that thing is, again, when you start to get 10 people,
Yeah.
then
Yeah, well,
that's
I'm not sure
it
if you
doesn't
know this
take
or
a
not,
book.
but heterodox won't allow me to be a part of their organization.
Really?
Yep.
Why?
Due to my satire.
Really?
Yes. So that's like another thing. It's like people got to use a variety of tactics here, and the other one is fair. Like I look at the pledges you got to make to be in these things. So fair, I couldn't sign on to their pledge. Right? So it's like something about turning the other cheek or something. It's like no, if you hit me, I hit you back twice as hard. Like that's how
Right,
that's important to have people doing that. James Lindsay ask James Lindsay to turn the other cheek. Like no,
right, right,
like
right, right.
why
Yeah.
like this imposition of this civility stuff and everything is just like and we heterodox has got a bit of that going on. So I
Right,
was
right.
really
I know it's a
pissed
bit
off to get
controversial that way.
this
Yeah.
this email from them wondering if I was the author of the Francis McGrath Twitter account. It's like piss off. I'm not gonna have anything to do with you. Um anyway,
Huh.
but still they do good work. Like again, I'm happy to like I'm interested and they do good events and stuff, but they they shoot themselves in the foot by this kind of stuff. Anyway, speaking of controversial items, which is probably the most controversial of all the controversies, as far as I can tell, is the Israel Palestine meltdown. In terms of discussions, like I think it's
Right.
important to point out up front that you know the kind of violence and killing and so on that is happening is horrific. Everyone, but we as academics, regardless, like we should be able to talk about genocides and all the most horrible things in the world
Hmm.
in a dispassionate way. And if we can't do
Hmm.
that, we shouldn't be academics because that's what we're
Right.
here. So
Yeah.
like this is kind of the problem is that we get people who are very emotionally invested in these
Yeah.
matters, which they're entitled to be because they've got some associations with these things.
Right.
Uh, but we also need to have people who can try and separate that out from their thing and just discuss the the
Yeah.
various arguments and so on. So
What was
what is
interesting
your
about
so I was just going to
what
ask you, what is your, how are you seeing all this that's unfolding with the discussions of Israel Palestine?
well, what you mentioned there, I think what's interesting about this one, a couple things are interesting, but one that I think is notable, just occurred to me, is that when you said it was the most controversial or the hottest thing, like really yikes. I'm not sure if I agree in some ways,
Mm,
because in this case, you do hear both sides in the mainstream media. On most other issues of controversy, you hear
yeah,
one side, and if you advocate for the other one, you better watch it.
yeah. Well, you better
This
watch
one,
this one. It depends. So I'm not sure. Well, we'll get to this one in my segment because I don't want to. So, in my well, this is an interesting disagreement that you and I have because on the Israel Palestine file, I am the most careful. That is the file I am the most careful on, and I am the most reluctant to speak on because I sense because of the history and everything and the the kind of misinterpretation of comments that you can get yourself into a hate speech thing pretty quickly on that file. And next to the trans issues, which I guess is the next one, that's really bad as well. But it seems to me that people have more of a sense that that's absurd.
do you think even these are more dangerous than, say, residential school
Yes,
discussions, or
yes,
really?
depending upon where you go with it.
Right.
Like I talked to lots of people about this question. Well, Karl Marx was on the Jewish question. that was the that's the kind of seminal work on it is on the Jewish question, which is like foundational for talking about this issue in historical materialism, and that is dangerous, very very dangerous. Which and I'm trying to work through right now. I'm just trying to see because I find that there's just not enough openness in the discussion. That's my first thing is that we should be able to discuss on the Jewish question without fear of being through some, put through some hate speech tribunal. But I'm very nervous about it. And the trans thing, I'm also nervous about because I know, if you start opposing pronoun usage and so on, like, but then that's not just the ideas there. That's actual action. So there's a difference between ideas and action. I think that the ideas on the Jewish question, as Marx would say, on the Jewish question, even saying on the Jewish question, because I believe Hitler had on the Jewish question too. So both Marx and Hitler looked at this. Anyway, I just like I can sense just even talking about this. I'm going, oh, like this is so difficult, and I don't, I got enough problems already without wading into that kind of can of worms. But I think it's important to be principled because, I have colleagues who are under the gun now, and people that I am trying to fight for, who are supporters of the Palestinian cause. Like they're getting Mark Ayash, who's at Mount Royal, who we would disagree with on most things. I support his arguments. He's being attacked by some Zionist organization. Natalie Knight, who is at Langara College. I'm not sure if you know about the Natalie Knight case. Anyway, this is currently a matter of great controversy. She was not as a professor, nothing to do with Langara. She was at a rally, a Palestinian, let's say a decolonization rally. So it was like a broader thing than just Palestine, but it was about decolonization. And she referred to the Hamas attacks as an incredible and amazing act of resistance against Israeli oppression. Now, that I would not agree with her characterization of this, but she should not have been investigated by her college for this. If you take issue with her view, which is shared by a significant number of people, then let's have it out here, but don't get Langara to fire her, to suspend her. She's currently was on leave, was being investigated. Anyway, I don't know what the outcome of that is. I've been trying to contact her, but of course she probably hates me because of my indigenous. She's a indigenous decolonizer kind of thing. So
right.
She knows who I am. But anyway, I was just trying to say, look, I want to find out more information about this as to what's going on because I don't know the exact. All I know is she said these things. A whole bunch of people got really upset and started, sending thousands of emails to the president. And then all of a sudden she's on leave and she, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, but that's not good. That's not good. And, Steven Pinker, who has not acted well in some circumstances with respect to the Jewish question, fortunately stood up with respect to Harvard and said, we don't want to use this as an excuse to tighten the authoritarianism.
Right.
We need to just there's like this huge hypocrisy that exists, but we want to go back to the free speech side of things, not use this current thing to now tighten things against all the Palestinian activists here. So that's kind of the key thing. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people who are not very principled on this at all.
Right.
They use freedom of expression as a weapon against their enemies. And it's like, I'm an academic. I'm not an activist. I have my theoretical position, but I would like to think at the university, we should be able to discuss all ideas. If you're going to now argue for, the mass extermination, like now, okay, we can talk about whether this should be allowed or not, because we did have in the case of Rwanda, some leader getting on the radio and saying that, this particular group were a bunch of cockroaches and should be exterminated. And then we had, hundreds of thousands of people killed, like that's the kind
Yeah.
of thing that can happen. But if we're just talking about, some kind of ideas and the nature of what,
Yeah.
uh, you know, Palestinian rights are, and the nature of like Israeli rights, and whether Israel as a Jewish state should
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
should exist, or like these are all open questions. Anyway, I've been going on and on and on about this, but we are in my segment now, or your segment in terms of questions. So I'm just going to turn it over to you now and let you take
Sure.
over.
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's lots of things I wanted to ask you about. And I guess I wanted to start by um asking you a little about your background because I haven't heard much about you and what brought you to your interests. Like even, how long is this something you were interested in, these sort of um political science or indigenous issues from a young age, or maybe you could tell me a little bit about what made you interested in these issues.
Yeah. So I did my master's at the University of Victoria in the political science department. And I was somewhat enamored with postmodernism at the time, largely due to laziness, because postmodernism has these kinds of tactics that kind of are like, for people who don't really know the Mott and Bailey kinds of things, get kind of like they get put off balance by them. So I had a certain amount of success. I was able to punch above my intellectual weight by using postmodern, sophistic tactics. So that happened. So I got my master's relatively easily without a lot of intellectual heft to it. Um, and then I wanted to work in the government, and so I decided to go to the Northwest Territories, because I had a friend who worked in the Northwest Territories, and he said it was a great area to get in there because everyone is very transient and so on. So I went up there.
But was your master's thesis on something related to what you'd be doing in the North?
No, it was on the media. So it was on Greenpeace, actually, the framing of Greenpeace in the mass media. So that was
Okay.
my master's thesis. And framing is a kind of a postmodern thing, which is like it's about the frame, like all frame, depending upon your frame, it has some validity, I guess, because it is like about this kind of social construction area. Um, anyway, so he was on Greenpeace, and I had the master's, so I thought I'd have a pretty good shot at getting in the government. So when I was working for the government, I got in, and so I had this, great government jobs without very much experience at all. And that's when two things happened to me. One, I the indigenous file is very, very significant in the North, so I became aware of that. And secondly, I met Albert Howard, who was a historical materialist, which comes out of the Marxist tradition, and was was totally anti postmodern, like like, and thought it was just BS and irrational and so on. And so when I tried to kind of put my postmodern arguments forward, I got uh, I got hit with rationality, and I realized that it was just fraudulent what I was doing, and like
Hmm.
I should be more honest and try and understand things as opposed to be engaged in these kinds of postmodern games. So I had a bit of background in the whole postmodernist kind of thing. Anyway,
Oh,
at that time, we when I was working for the Department of Renewable Resources, one of my jobs was to indigenize the government. So incorporate indigenous ways of knowing into various government programs and so on. So
how long ago would this have been?
this was in 1990. So it was 19, started around 1994, I guess. That's when I started doing that.
Oh, that long ago.
Yeah.
Okay. I always think of
So,
these as kind of recent developments,
no,
but
no, no, no. This has been going on for a long time. So Albert as well was a member of the Aboriginal industry at the time, an innocent member of the Aboriginal industry. So he thought that his consulting stuff, which he was like doing for various businesses and everything, he got involved with the Indigenous organizations to help them with their Indigenous rights stuff. And when we were talking about this, we realized that there was this big basically fraudulent stuff going on with this industry and government and all the just wasted time. And it came to a head when I was charged with going to listen to the traditional knowledge hearings for the Broken Hill Properties diamond mine in the north. Anyway, so I was trying to talk to people about this. Like, this was not, and either people were corrupt or they were sort of, we didn't have the term woke, but they were woke about it or whatever. But no one really wanted to critically analyze this traditional knowledge thing, and it was just nonsense. BHP didn't care a hoot about the traditional knowledge stuff. They didn't even know what it was. All they knew is that there's indigenous groups that were opposing this diamond mine, and this was how they were going to get them to agree, was to shovel out money out of the back of a pickup truck to various indigenous spokespeople and their consultants and everything, and then get them to do these useless studies, which they weren't going to use anyway, but it was all just a manipulative tactic. Anyway, so Albert and I, at the time, decided to write an article about this in the journal Policy Options called Traditional Knowledge Threatens Environmental Assessment. And it was about how people were doing this because they thought it would be helpful, but it was actually preventing a rigorous evaluation of things. And it was just a total manipulative tactic by BHP to get their diamond mining. So we wrote this. And of course, this was not popular amongst the government. They actually suspended me without pay for 2 weeks for doing this, or a week or whatever, because they said that I had breached my oath of loyalty for writing this article as a Canadian citizen. Like, I wasn't writing as a government employee, I was writing as a Canadian citizen. But in the government, things are much more, not, you don't have protections or anything. So you're just, you're not allowed to do that kind of thing, according to them. I never pursued it very much. I was trying to
So
pursue
what was it so what was the complaint against you precisely?
that I had breached the oath of loyalty against the guy. So you're supposed to
But
be,
what did you like by writing a journal article outside of, as independent of the government, like on your own time, or?
yes, yeah. So you've kind of got to support, the argument was you got to support government policies if you're working there. Like, it's a bit of an open question as to whether that was the case. But at the time I was thinking, I really shouldn't be in the government because I want to speak the truth about this. So I should go into the university system. That was my, because that's what I thought the university system was about at the time, was that I had been misled by all these postmodernists at University of Victoria into going down this ridiculous alleyway, blind
Mm-hmm.
alleyway. And now I understood what universities were supposed to be about. And I had this incredible perspective that no one knew about because it was all under wraps in the government. So I could bring my expertise from the government into the academic realm, and that would be the thing to do. And at the same time, Albert and I were beginning to write on disrobing the Aboriginal industry. That book was starting at this time too. So I was like, oh, that's great. So I went off to York University in Toronto with I was so arrogant. It was amazing. Like, I was just like, I know all this stuff, all these academics, they have no experience in the government. They don't know what's going on. All this indigenous, their understanding is totally flawed. Anyway, so I was a bit of a, you know, if now I'm much more humble. I wasn't particularly humble at the time. And so I didn't get along with anyone there. And I was thinking at the time, I was going, oh God, I don't know how I'm going to be able to get a PhD out of this. Like, what am I going to do? And I was working with like these kind of quote unquote Marxists who were just like postmodern, like completely postmodern, and had none of the economic theories. They weren't interested in that. Fortunately, I got hooked up with Leo Panich, who was We didn't get along very well, but he was an honest scholar. Like he really was serious scholar. And so he agreed to take me on. And so then began my long ordeal of working on my dissertation, which was a critique of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples from a historical materialist standpoint, which in this was started in oh god, like like late 90s, and it got published in 2019 as Separate but Unequal. It took me 10 years through the peer review process to get that book published.
Wow.
Yeah, it was just, and it's just still like this. The fact that it got published at all is just absolutely amazing, and just was that window, that very, very short window before everything fell apart. Anyway, so Leo and I fought for months on end about this because he was very skeptical about cultural evolution. He didn't accept cultural evolution. He didn't think it was valid. But arguing with him, he kind of just finally threw up his hands and said, I don't agree with this, but you have enough, like, you have enough serious scholarship behind you to have this go forward into the public realm.
Yeah. Oh,
So it
that's
was
good.
very, although it was very frustrating, and I was like, I was just at the end of my tether because it's like everyone else gets to, you know, write off just nonsense, and I gotta just like grind away here endlessly on, like trying to support every single point. But
Yeah.
it was a good training ground for me in the humanities. So it wasn't scientific,
Yeah.
but it was humanities, and it was argumentation. It was looking at the different arguments. It was evaluation. So anyway, so I got my PhD, and then another one. So I had this incredibly short window, which I just managed to just squeeze through. At the same time, Mount Royal was making a transition from a college to a university. I had my PhD in 2006, and I'd done some things, and because of my, like, I had Leo Panich, and I had Alan Cairns was the other person on my PhD committee. So I had a lot of heavy hitters behind me, and I had a very unusual perspective that was valued at the time. I got into Mount Royal, and then I started that, and I was able to survive there, and to some extent even thrive until 2020 when the George Floyd thing happened,
Right.
and then it all ended. It all ended with a crash because,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was kind of that. So I've been at this. That's why I'm so feisty, is because I've stood my ground since the 90s, argued the points. I had Albert Howard, of course, played a massive role because I don't think I would have had the confidence to do it without him, because he just has this, if you think you're right, you should fight it out. Don't give in, just fight. And so
So, but that's
that's
what
not,
I wanted to ask you about you. I wanted to ask you about what do you think it is about you that makes you, I guess, what I would consider a dissident, right? So a lot of people would just fold, don't want any trouble.
yep,
Got a nice job here.
yep,
I'm not going to say what I think.
yep.
You know, I talk to people, all of like colleagues, like, well, I'm not going to stick my neck out. This is
Yeah, no,
stupid, but so what is it about you? Is it, is this a personality trait, or is it, I'm just curious, like,
yeah.
why do you think you do this?
Well, I had, you need to have, I think, at least one other person who's supporting you. Like if you're alone, I don't know if that's, well, you have to be a particular, well, Albert could do it alone, but that like he's the more special character, I think, than me, because I used to be very worried. Like, well, now I've just kind of, because of being, constantly involved in fighting, I've sort of become, much more uh, less worried. So I used to worry about, like, especially in the early years of my time at Mount Royal. And there's a couple of moments that were really, not fun at all. But Mount Royal was a great institution at the time too. So there was a great provost whose name was Robin Fisher, and a great dean whose name was Manuel Merton. and they knew what an academic institution was about, and they supported me a great deal in the first 3 years while I was getting tenure. And I made some mistakes, and no one held it against me. Like that's the thing, is that if you're in a position that I am, you're going to make mistakes because you're like entering into new things all the time, and you have to learn, and you do some dumb things. And when I did dumb things, as long as I said, oh yeah, that was a dumb thing, they would go, okay, like, we all make
Yeah.
mistakes, like the sort of thing. Now it's like, no, like if you do one wrong thing, or don't even do a wrong thing, I
Right.
mean, you're gonna get just piled on. You can't
Right. And the
recover.
rules aren't clear ahead of time, so you don't even know what the rules are.
Yeah, no, and so at the time, people were kind of, they were helping me, like
Mhm.
but then in 2000 and starting in 2015. So I think that I don't think I'm particularly a special person, is my general sense. I had an environment that, you know, encouraged my feistiness, which, so I guess I'm kind of feisty. But I could have had that feistiness in a bad way. Like I could have been like with the postmodernist stuff at UVic. Like fortunately I was out of there in 1992. So they had a terrible thing that happened. I'm not sure if you know about what happened at UVic. And this happened right, like I was leaving when it was starting, and I'm just thinking, if I had just been a bit earlier, I could have been part of this horrible thing that happened, which was a woke uh, challenge to the department by a bunch of gender feminists. Uh, so there was a woman by the name of Summer Broadrup who was a gender feminist, woke feminist, and it was like a power struggle, a serious power struggle that was taking place, and they accused a bunch of male professors. Well, not her. She did it under the cloak of anonymity because she had this committee that had a bunch of students. So this is like a classic woke move.
Wow.
So she had a bunch of students in this committee, and they made these accusations against male members, not anyone by name, but generally that these professors were engaged in racist and sexist conduct against students. This was the committee report that they did. Anyway, the male professors at the time, of course, said, "We, because you didn't name anyone, we're all under this cloud, and you should back up your accusations with evidence or apologize." And of course, the administration, being its cowardly self, didn't take the principled stand and just did this all like, let's have a meeting. And
Wow.
anyway, that if I had been like, I could have seen, because of my, like, I had this postmodern thing going on, and again, women are oppressed and women don't lie, and it's like, no, like,
Right. Yeah.
doesn't matter if it's, you're dealing with power struggles here, so these, it's going to be whatever, moves the needle more in your direction. And if
Right.
you don't have evidence, if you don't have these kind of procedurally fair things, you're going to have that happen. So that could have been a bad path, etc. And so it's kind of like a bunch of conditions I can see happening, which now give me an understanding of the principles involved, which is like, I believe in the truth. Like, I believe in this idea of the truth. And and I think it's important. It's not a political, like, I think it's a human thing. And if we could just orient to that as opposed to um, all the politics of it, then we could kind of find out what the best politics are. But
Hmm.
because we've lost the plot,
Yeah.
uh, we're going to be dragged down into some horrible situation, which is unfolding as we speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that I wanted to follow up there is so I think it sounds like you had a background in postmodernism, so maybe you had your antennae up and you could recognize what's going on.
Yep.
Um, And it also sounds well, and you went through a ringer of like meeting these rational people with high academic standards.
Yep.
So you kind of run compromising and truth seeking.
Yep.
But I might suggest you also maybe have a slightly disagreeable personality. Would
I
that be
do.
fair?
I get
Okay.
it's weird. Like it's weird because my parents were very uh, deferential to authority, but somewhat disagreeable. Well, my mother was disagreeable, but also uh, deferential to authority. So it was kind of one of those weird things where you would be disagreeable, but then you would worry about your disagreement. Like it would be this kind of
Mhm.
constant. So you become parallel if you like she was never she was like a kind of a tragic tale of someone who was very smart but could not just was dysfunctional. Just couldn't do anything. So there's that danger a bit. So I had to kind of think through a bunch of things, which I'm still working on. But I like to, I sort of aspire to not try to win the argument. Like don't try to win the argument. Don't try to be ambitious. Don't be ambitious. Try to figure out what's true. Like if you can
Mhm.
have that as your sort of,
Humility, right?
yeah, it's like humility. I think that's probably like if it's used well, that word, like being 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 humble does not mean not having confidence in one's, but it means like don't,
Being open to,
yeah, and especially if you know that you're wrong.
right? Yeah.
There's no shame in it. Like
Oh yeah.
unfortunately people hold it against you, so you can't just sort of go, oh, that was a mistake,
I'm
like,
quite delighted if I find out that I'm wrong in something.
yeah.
Like I have to realize that's actually a good thing that I've come to a conclude. I've learned something. So
No,
I
it's a
try to.
difficult one. Like I've had a hard time with that in the past. Like it goes against my, I don't know. Like it wasn't easy to do that, but whenever you feel yourself arguing a point with which you don't really agree, like you have to give yourself, you should recognize, at least recognize it,
Right.
and
Yeah.
try to change course.
Yeah.
Whether you're gonna,
So
do a full public,
yeah. But the
but
other thing
it
I
shouldn't
wanted
be
to,
that bad. Like that's the thing
yeah,
is that like why is there such a, why is it held against people so much if you just say okay,
yeah.
I
I think
just
you just have to have some self, be okay with it, and just
and
your own
I
opinion.
give you a compliment. Like I see you as almost bet like you seem to be much more um in a kind of thing like I know some things I'm pretty confident about, but there's a lot of things I don't know. So I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna kind of enter into things that I like. James, that's a problem with James Lindsay a little bit. I think is that I think he's too, he's not humble enough. I guess.
Maybe, yeah, yeah. He goes a little
Like
bit
I've
too.
seen him do some things like and this too with this insulting. Like I've watched a few debates with him where he starts like whenever someone starts saying something like someone who's 5 years old would know this or something like that kind of thing, or even a 5 year old would know that, or like this is really not a good mechanism for trying to, now sometimes you're
Right.
dealing with people who are being just complete jerks,
Yeah.
and so, like, but still you've got to, I don't think that's a good, and there was I'm not sure if you know her, she's her name's Posey Parker, she's a,
Yeah.
anyway, so her and Lindsay, like,
They got into it.
she and Lindsay, Lindsay did this kind of terrible thing to her where she's just kind of saying something and he says, I wouldn't pick a fight with me if I were you, or something like that. It's like, well, yeah. But that's kind of just social media too. Like social
Right.
media is the worst kind of,
It rewards bad behavior.
yeah, it does. So like, and sometimes you need it because you can really, hit hard with it. Like, yeah, especially if
Mhm.
you get the satire going, you
Yeah.
can really do a kind of a very biting kind of, of
Right.
people who deserve it. Like
Right.
there's people now who seriously deserve to be taken down a peg, a serious peg. And I'll
Hmm.
name them: Sean Carlton, Negan Sinclair, Keisha Supernon. those people should be taken down a peg because for their arrogance and their absolute inability to operate in any kind of framework within the humanities. They're just pure ideologues and activists. And, we have a very important book out called Grave Error. It's Flanagan and Champion with a whole bunch of articles, basically critiquing this, mostly the Kamloops case, but like the whole residential school stuff generally. There's probably errors in that book. There's probably some flawed arguments, but it is a group of people who are honestly trying to, create a better understanding. And then, like for Sean Carlton, he'll put out a meme saying, like he just is not, is just like total dismissive. I'm not gonna, waste my time and bother to, engage with this at all. It's already discredited, stuff. Well, first of all, he's never engaged at all with anyone. So, discredited, like, there's not even a conversation that's happened. So, this is this sort of thing that's going on in the universities is just, completely acceptable, completely unacceptable. And
but these are the people
that,
who are pushing, making it illegal to question, like denialism. They're pushing for those types of laws, right? So they're very dangerous, very dangerous.
Yes, very, very dangerous.
So just one more thing on this that I wanted to ask you about. So about dissidents. So you kind of get connected to these people who kind of stuck their neck out.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is that, I don't know, 90% are people of faith. And I'm gonna make a presupposition and assume that you are not one of those.
No, I'm an atheist.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And
Yep.
I wouldn't call myself an atheist, but I'm not. Couldn't call myself a person of faith either.
Yep.
What do you think that's about?
Well, there's one view now which is called the substitution hypothesis. Have you heard of this view?
No.
It's that people need something to believe in.
Oh, G.K. Chesterton. Is that the
I'm not
Chesterton?
sure. Maybe I don't know who started it, but I've heard it a number of times. Which
The famous quote from
yeah,
Chesterton.
I think it's an interesting I hope. Well, I have to go with whatever's true. So, but I doubt it's true. But I also emotionally don't, hope that it's not true, which is people need to believe in something, and this is belief not in the sense of confidence. So, I said I believe in the truth. Um, that means that I've thought about this a lot as being the overriding thing that we can have agreement on, and if we give up on that, we might as well just go back to being tribal societies because civilization can't exist without that. Like that's what allows us to come together and try and figure things out. And if we can't do that, then everything's impossible. But this is faith. So belief in the absence of evidence is people. That's a very strongly held thing in what's called, and you probably being biochemist, you've heard of the reptilian cortex of humanity. Like human brain has a reptilian cortex.
I've heard the term. I don't know much about it. Yeah.
Well, it's like the basis of all the like you have the reptilian cortex first, and then everything else in the brain. I guess the reptiles had the first brain, maybe. It's the earliest.
I'm not a really good biologist.
Yeah,
I'm not that kind of background.
It's called the reptilian cortex, and I'm sure that's because it's the earliest brain. It's the foundation
right.
of what all the other things are. And that reptilian cortex is a instinctual. It's instinct. It's in the area of instinct, and all the learning and the more complex brain functions came later. And of course, the human brain has a huge amount of sort of post-reptilian things. But whenever we get into a threatening situation or whatever, or we're uncertain, is the reptilian cortex that asserts itself, and faith would be kind of tied to this, and tribalism, same kind of thing, is that we revert to that when we're the veneer of civilization begins to crumble, then these sorts of
Right.
things. And so what's happened, and this is very strong. Now, my own view is I think it's likely that eventually, as we evolve, we will overcome faith. Like, we still need things to unite us and have as an overarching thing, but that can be, in historical materialism, it's our cooperation with other humans is that will eventually assert itself because of previous developments, possibly, but maybe not. Like, it's open ended as to what it is. So we could have that as our the thing that's going to be the overarching thing, or it could be religion. But we need something, and if we don't have something, then something else fills its, and the argument is that wokeism, for the substitution hypothesis, is because we got rid of religion, now we've got this new woke stuff that is taking its place. Because the argument is that religion is a kind of a natural thing for humans, and if we don't have religion, we'll just invent another. So that's one possibility. I would argue against that myself, and I think that the problem is woke. We're talking about wokeism. Where did wokeism? Is that what was that the question? Sorry, could you
Well,
just
no, I'm just well, partially, yeah. So, but I mean, if you look about dissidents in academia or in society general who are kind of pushing back against this cultural revolution, maybe if you want to use the broadest term,
yeah, yeah,
why are they mostly people of faith? At least
yeah.
in my
So
observation.
that's one thing. The second thing is that faith is not relativistic. So religions are not relativistic. So you're a Muslim and you believe the Quran was whatever by Muhammad and so on, right? Like, there's not like, oh well, that's your view. We all have different views and both are equally true. Like, it's like, no, if you
Right.
don't believe that, we're gonna show you the sword and you are gonna be, whatever. Christianity would be, again, it's not relativistic. It's like Christ is the Son of God and so on. Like, so because it's anti-relativistic, it has weapons to fight against the relativism, the subjectivity of wokeism. And Christianity is now becoming woke, right? Like, it's being destroyed because of its woke assault on it. But
Mm-hmm.
Islam is not being destroyed by wokeism. So we've got, that's going to be one of the forces against it. Unfortunately, it's not a very, I don't really want to attach my wagon to that kind of side. That's why I think this parental rights thing is very disturbing, because it's getting into all these, what I consider to be, sort of primitive religious things that are like pre-woke, but and it's, I don't know, but that's why I think it's not relativistic is what allows it to fight against it more effectively than liberals like myself. Like, I'm sort of trapped a little bit in this because I'm a historical materialist, but I have socially liberal values. So when I first encountered trans activism, like gay marriage or like homosexuality or whatever, I really didn't. It's like, whatever. Like, you think you're a man or a woman, and you just do this, and you wear a dress or you don't, or you wear, who
Yeah.
cares?
Mm-hmm.
But then it had a much more sinister. Uh, I was worried about the authoritarian character of it from the
Yeah.
beginning. But it's now, it's like it's wreaking havoc
Mm-hmm.
on, I think, uh, foundational kinds of human sort of institutional forms, like the family. Is that I think the family is, we need families. Like, we need children to have male and female role models. We need children to feel secure that they have like it's probably a basic human thing, and to just try and destroy that is gonna cause serious mental illness and all sorts of children. Like that's not even getting into the surgeries and
Right.
the puberty
Yeah.
blockers and all these sorts of things. So I
But
think
don't
liberals
you
are a disadvantage against wokeism.
but don't you think, Francis, that most of the problems, this is what I think on any of these issues, like this, like the trans issue, is that really it's a speech issue, right? Like if we were allowed to speak freely about
Yeah.
things, we'd work it out, we'd resolve it, right? But because of the increasing, not just intimidation of activists, but now having legislative and institutional backing,
Yep.
you don't allow a free flow of exchange of ideas, and there's no pushback.
Like in a less corrupted system, this would be. I think my fear is we've gone too far in the corrosion of the institutions, and then it's like the expression taking a spoon to a knife fight. This kind of idea. So liberalism is a spoon in the knife fight of identity politics that is running rampant because of the corrosion of the liberal kind of institutions. And so what happens? It's like pacifists, like the whole pacifist kind of thing, is that you've got a absolute, Hitler and all the extermination and everything that's happening, and then you got all these pacifists who are saying, let's not go to war. It's like, well, Hitler loves you.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to
Right.
turn the other cheek, and you're going to get slammed. Like
Yeah.
you have to have some ability to fight back, and
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately the freedom of expression sort of side of things assumes a fair and open universe of things, and if it's not that way, it's not going to be very effective to do anything. So and it's difficult because I'm not a person who's really uh I'm not a an activist type, and so I don't want to have a war, but I fear that's going to be the only way to solve this, like, because it's the people who we're dealing with. That's an interesting. What are we dealing like right now? I'm just what exactly are we dealing with here? We've got wokeism, which is like this identity politics that is totalitarian. We've got diversity, inclusion, and equity, die stuff, which seems to be about this professional, like running the government or running bureaucracies, in some way. There's some kind of connection between those two things. And then there's the sort of authoritarian moves that where these, well, according to James Lindsay, which I think he has some insights into this, these are useful idiots for the real fascist.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what I would critique. I think Lindsay, if he could just replace fascism with Marxism, he'd be onto something. Like I think it's fascist. I think this is complete. Like this is where we're going. I think the model to look at is Nazi Germany, that the one that comes closest to what we're doing. But because wokeism pretends to be this kind of quote unquote socialistic kind of thing, everyone goes, the problem is socialism and the problem is Marxism. And so we're all, worried about that when really it is, there's going to be something moving in that is going to have a fascistic character to it. Or we could just make it more broadly totalitarian. I think that China is fascistic. So China is got capitalism, that it's got a lot of it's got state control, and it's controlling things in the interests of, I'm not quite sure how it determines that. But who does it determine who gets the shares? Like what is it, the equal shares or the appropriate shares of the what's produced. But anyway, China, I think, is fascist, not like calls itself the Communist Party. But just because I say I'm a man, it doesn't mean I'm a man. Like, how can you have a communist party
Mm-hmm.
that has billionaires and has a
Yeah.
capitalist system? And that's not, it's using that affiliation that people bought into, 70 years ago
Yeah.
or whatever.
That's
To
an interesting point. Have you heard of Tom Sowell's comparison of fascism and communism?
I don't know. I know I should take a look at that. That would be very interesting. What
Yeah,
is it?
so really he basically says they're almost identical, really. It's just the key differences in communism is that the state owns everything, right? In
Hmm.
fascism, you have private ownership of businesses and factories, but they only own and control and have private property to the extent that they are allowed to by the state, right? So it's sort of they're controlled by the state. That might be so. In that definition, China seems to fit well into the fascist
Yeah,
box. I
yeah. Well, the state. So in the case of, if we're going to look at actually what a communist system is, it would be originally the state or public ownership, some form of public ownership, allowing resources to be distributed on the basis of need. So that would be an actual communist system. If we were going to say that's it. So whether or not there's a state that's needed or not is an interesting question. That was kind of the argument, is that the state, and gets into historical materialism's kind of theoretical understanding of the state, that the state exists in order to uphold differences that are irreconcilable. So when you have people who have differences that they can't reconcile, then you have the state come in and just clamps down on that, because it can't be worked out through some kind of democratic process. You need to have coercion. You need to have legitimate coercion brought in.
mm-hmm.
But fascism is state control of capitalism in the interests of a particular segment. In the case of Nazi Germany, it was the Aryan race, what was called the Aryan race. So Hitler had this idea of um, the German folk being oppressed, right? Because that was like the Treaty of Versailles, that the German folk, which is like the ethnic kind of Germans,
Mm-hmm.
they had been treated terribly by Europe and this and that. And now they were going to reach their actual potential. And in order to do this, you had to mow down all the Slavs and the Jews and all this, like,
Mm-hmm.
get rid of all the people who are standing in the way of the actual
Yep.
inheritors of the earth. And it was using capitalism, state control over capitalism, to put a chicken in every pot and to put a Volkswagen in every garage and this kind of thing. So that was going to
Right.
be, and of course, that was a very narrow understanding of who the actual
Mm-hmm.
citizens were, and every other element was just an obstacle in trying to achieve that. Like that
Yep.
was that was the Nazi. Now, whether you can have fascist, like other kinds of flavors of fascism, is interesting. In the case of China, if we're going to see China as a fascist state, which I think an argument can be made for that, who is the kind of privileged group that's seen as important? One thing that did happen for a while was they had what was called princelings. I'm not sure if you've heard about the princelings. Um, they were the descendants of the leaders of the Communist Party, who were given the shares, the important shares, and everyone else is kind of working for them. I have heard, though, from the political scientist Daniel Bell, who is an expert on China, they have what's, according to him, they have what's called a political meritocracy, which is very interesting. I used to teach this in my political science classes when I was still a professor, and I was always kind of introducing this to people. If it's true, he might have been like a stooge of the, but I think he was trying to understand China. Anyway, China has and this comes out of the Mandarins and everything in China, that they had this kind of bureaucratic class that was very well educated, and then they would use their expertise in the supposedly in the interests of all the peasants. Anyway, the political meritocracy is you get your position as a head bureaucrat by three things, by showing three things, excelling in three things. One, examinations. So you'd take an examination and you would whatever. And secondly, by being able to accomplish goals as at a lower level in the bureaucracy. So if you're a mayor of a particular district, you do very, very well, and whatever projects you're supposed to be doing, you get promoted on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
And thirdly, virtue, having a high level of virtue. And
Interesting.
that is working in the public good as opposed to your own self-interest. So that's evidently how they claim they want their political system. So they don't have anything about democracy. It's not about voting or democracy or anything. That's all that drags you down. To have democracy drags you down. You have this meritocracy system, and these experts run the system, the capitalist system, in the interests of all the people.
Right.
That could be, that's kind of got a fascistic.
Mm-hmm.
It's a non-ethnic based fascism, I guess, as opposed
Right.
to, but still, it maybe that's not fascism at all, because it's in the common interest. Whereas I don't think fascism sees the common interest as being important. It sees I think fascism has got an aristocratic character to it. There's a group that is superior, and the system is to kind of keep them in power so that they can maintain the state. And if you don't allow that to happen, your system will be overrun by the lower elements and disintegrate.
Right.
So, yeah.
I was just curious, you mentioned the oppression, right? That the German were oppressed. To what extent do you think oppression is a key factor in violent movements? Seeing yourself as oppressed, like taking on that identity of the oppressed. Is that a justification for violence?
Well, I think that it is, like, in the end, any kind of change, fundamental change, will there you will have violence. Like that's how fundamental change happens, is through violence. And oppression is one of the kind of the fuels. I guess it's a fuel for that. That if you have a fundamentally oppressive system, then violence is the only way you're going to change that fundamentally oppressive system. And this has happened, doesn't the French Revolution, and so, like, revolutionary situations. Revolutionary situations are, well, that's an interesting claim. Are revolutions always violent? Because you have things like the Glorious Revolution in the UK, where they changed from a aristocratic system to one that was run by businessmen and aristocrats. So it didn't become democratic, but it became less aristocratic. That was kind of, I think, what all the fights in 1600s are about. That was sort of seen as relatively peaceful. because it didn't overthrow the economic system. But I think there were still wars fought over the aristocrats and how much the businessmen were gonna. So I think so that's like violence, like because we lived in democratic times in the West. Violence has been very relatively. It's been from time to time, but it's nothing like what we would have seen, a couple hundred years ago. And sometimes there was just wars, endless wars, like the 100 Years' War, and like there's this constant fighting that was going on. So I think we've lived in a relatively peaceful time, which is kind of misled us into the way in which humans normally, the hope is that, we're learning some things, and we learn that we want to sort things out through discussion and laws and processes. But it looks like if we just look at the United States, I think there's going to be a civil war in the United States, because I don't think that the Trump segment, whatever that is, even if it's not Trump who's going to be part of it, it's like a grouping, cannot agree with the institutional aspects of the non-Trump kind of thing. So I think they're going to have to fight it out, is what's going to happen.
But don't you think that that fissure quite is prevalent throughout Western Anglosphere democracies? That there's, I mean, because I think we're in a cultural revolution, right?
Yeah.
Where we have elites that are to this new ideology of social justice, and maybe that, I don't know if it's unique to Trump. I don't get it. I think because now you can see how the battle lines are being drawn in Canadian politics on along those same lines. Poilievre is being analogized to Trump.
Yeah.
You see that you can do every Western Anglosphere democracy. It's kind of, if you're not on the woke side, you're a mega baddie. That's kind of, I sort of see that.
Yeah, it's just,
I don't
I
know what
guess
you think of that idea.
it's not as far along, I guess. So the U.S. is the most become tribal. So tribalism is asserted itself the most in the U.S. And it's less developed in the other and it's certainly the most. Although France, I don't quite know what's happening in France these days, because they won't show any of the, like, this is the other problem, the meat, like all these, no one is really doing journalism anymore.
Right.
It's all just supporting your own particular tribe that's happening in journalism. So you don't really hear about a lot that, like anything that goes against sort of the woke kind of position, you don't really hear about.
Yeah.
And this is another thing about wokeism, which I think is very important, besides the professional managerial class, from a historical materialist standpoint, is the international versus national capitalist class, the split in that. And wokeism is the international capitalist class. Like anything to do with social media, anything to do with banks, it's just complete woke, like woke. Like you go to a bank, you see like a pronouns of you got the flag, pride flag, you got the territorial land acknowledgements. It's just like in your face wokeism, and all the kind of advertisements are all like, minorities are all
right.
It's absurd. And then you got the kind of the industrial rump of the old capitalist system, coal production, oil and gas, auto sector, etc. And you'll see that for the Trump supporters, it's most clear in the U.S. is that it's all the kind of the rump of the Rust Belt. That's all Trump's national capitalist class.
Right.
And so that's a big part of it as well that needs to be theorized, that I'm kind of thinking through, but it's a very, very difficult
Could I
These are,
suggest a possibility why you think the United States is further along? Could it be that they just have a stronger First Amendment protections for speech? So you have a much more robust debate, whereas
yeah,
in Canada, people are much more hesitant to
yeah.
voice their dissent, or in
Uh,
other countries.
I
What do you think
think
of that
it's,
hypothesis?
uh, I think it's not, that's not economic. So I would, from my own uh, theoretical position, look at the economics of it. So the capitalist system is more uh, developed in the United States. So it's more gone down the, like, the increasing productivity route. And
Right.
so what we have is, well, my theoretical position, which has been being attacked by not by bad actors, but people who just say, yeah, she's trapped in her Marxism and she can't, get outside of it, which is fair enough, maybe so. I think that wokeism is the ideology of late capitalism. I really think that it, because of the nature of the capitalist system and the fact that we are so much into the service sector. So all the industrial stuff has been pushed to the developing world. We have the service sector. We have the rump of industrialism plus fuel, like any kind of, like, that's the fuel of production is often in controlled in various contexts. Because of our service sector character and all the boutique kind of stuff that we're trying to sell, wokeism just feeds into that. That's just the ideal position, which is sort of a consumption based kind of increase your consumption constantly. My One of my Facebook friends, Christopher Nagel, who is wrote a book called The Secular Fundamentalism. He's dealing with the secular fundamentalist. He's dealing with wokeism himself, and he says it's um, indulgence, indulgence capitalism. So, like, encouraging people to consume more as a solution for their problems. And
Right.
this is heading, and trans activism. He's the one who introduced me to some of the huge problems with trans activism. That's kind of the most woke of all the woke. So the most woke of all the woke is trans activism. The Israel-Palestine situation is a split in wokeism to some extent, I guess. I'm not sure exactly. It's definitely an issue that seems to have more, like, as you said, there's actually a debate going on about this. Like, there's the different viewpoints. It's just that you're worried to you've got, instead of one landmine, you've got two landmines.
Yeah.
Worried about stepping on one of them.
Right. Yeah.
But still,
Yeah.
at least because you got the two landmines, it's almost like they're actually creating some kind of thing. So
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
well, Geoff, I know we've been going more than 2 hours here, so I should probably I could go on forever talking about this because I find this is like at the heart of trying to figure it out. But before we close, is there things that something you think should be said that we haven't talked about?
Not really. There's so much that I didn't get to any of the questions hardly I was going to ask you, but that's okay.
I think we got into some of the wokeism DEI, like that for me right now. How DEI or die is related to wokeism, like
Yeah.
that's
I,
something that I don't really know whether they're the same thing or whether they're different. And like I'm still thinking through that. So part of this thing was just me just
right.
thinking loud, which I don't. I'm trying to
What do you
write.
think of what do you think of Eric Kaufman's definition of woke? Do
What
you
is
know
the
it?
definition? Who's that?
So
Sorry.
his definition is that it's the making sacred of certain identity groups. That is really the
I
heart of
think
it.
that there's non-woke things, though. My own definition is more specific, which is social justice, identity politics, that has become totalitarian. So the reason why I have all those caveats is because there's identity politics, which is not woke, which is like white identity politics. So part of that's part of the base of Trump is the white identity politics. There's Zionist identity politics, which is not woke. It's so that's why we're getting that clash, is because we get Zionist identity politics and woke identity politics, and they're hitting against one
Right.
another. So it's social justice identity politics that is woke, but it's also, we used to have social justice identity politics 20 years ago, which was not woke because it wasn't insisting that it should be the thing that everyone is pretending to believe. Like now it's like,
Right.
okay, you don't, if you refuse to accept women have penises and all this kind of stupid stuff, uh, then you're gonna get taken out. Like this is
But that's because those identities have been made sacred, right? Like the white or the Zionism, those aren't sacred. They haven't been made sacred, right? So they can be, it's whereas if the other identities, there's a certain identity classes that have been made sacred, so it's just sacrilegious to question. I think
yeah,
that's what he's
that
getting
might
at.
be a better definition, like made sacred. I just always with sacred is when I hear the word sacred, it's like, ugh. Like, but true, it's sacred in that it cannot be questioned.
Hmm.
So maybe I don't know if there's a word that, like, the problem with sacred is it makes you think that it's some kind of religious thing, which unless
Right.
the supernatural's involved, then I find out. But if there's a word for sacred that is just that dogma, like dogmatic. So
Yeah.
uh what was the definition that was before? What was that
Just making sacred certain identity groups, I think is.
Yeah,
I'd
so
have to look at it. I heard him a few times, and it,
yeah, but
and
if we could have like whatever the dogmatic, like the questioning, the unable to question, that sort
mhm.
of thing, like that's wokeism. That's a big part of wokeism, but it's unable to question from a particular this kind of intersectional identity type of
Right.
thing.
But
So
sacred is also good because it's also there's a certain celebratory or almost like you have to kind of bow and sort of make,
yeah,
you know,
affirmation,
tithes, and it's like I think that it's more than just you can't question it. It's also you have to
celebrate.
elevate it, right, and celebrate it. So I don't know. I think the more I think about it, there's something to his definition.
Well, I think sacred, it would, I guess, depend upon the definition of sacred. So if sacred is that thing, so this is definitely, and Fleckrose and Lindsay use the word reification. So, but that's more accepting that it's real. So if you're a man who thinks you're a woman, you must make real that woman identity. So like everyone's got to say yes, you're a woman, and in fact now you've got to actually celebrate that someone's saying that they're a woman. So it's not just
Right.
enough to do that. So we're moving into this kind of propagandistic type of, went from kind of discouraging any questioning to now, okay, you've got to be up there as a cheerleader. And if you aren't clapping hard enough, then you're getting sent to the gulag.
Right. Right. Don't want to be the last person to stop clapping,
Yeah, don't be the last person to stop clapping.
or the first person, I guess.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, the first person. You don't want to be the first person to stop clapping.
Yeah.
Okay, Geoff. Well, this has been really, really interesting and very, very, like, I found it to be very helpful because I think you
Well,
are a
good.
true, you're so calm, first of all, and you are, you don't get, you're trying to find the truth. So that's very, we need, you're this just the ideal,
Well,
professor.
I'm quite ignorant, right? I'm just a scientist who doesn't know anything about this. So,
In
and
this
I'm
day
not
and
afraid to
age,
ask stupid questions.
ignorance is ignorance is something that is probably beneficial
Yeah.
because the people who are been schooled, and all these things are just there. They've been hit with the venom of the jewel wasp, and they can't think anymore. So we kind of have
Yep.
to be sort of taking away some of the things that we've had, and then
Mhm.
we can learn. We can start afresh. Have a
Yeah.
bit of hit the reset button a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it'd be nice to be intellectually playful again a little bit,
Exactly.
and that's something I actually noticed when I first joined SAFS. The first meeting I went to was very enlightening for me because I was like, wow, professors are actually getting into heated arguments. Like that never happens on university campus. Quite
Yeah,
refreshing.
I know, and that wasn't that long ago that existed. Like
Right.
I'm
It's
amazed.
unfathomable now. It's unthinkable.
No, no, everyone's so afraid. It's just really just terrible. It's just killing. It's killing everything in the university system for sure. Okay, Geoff. Well, I just wanted to thank you so much for appearing on the Rational Space Disputations.
Thank you for having me.